You are kneeling in the sand and your knees are on fire. The iron collar around your neck is tightened so hard you can barely swallow. A chain ties you to 11 other women. Listen to their breathing. Some are crying. One is praying in a language you don't recognize. A man's shadow blots out the sun, half a second of relief from the heat. Then hands seize your jaw and force your mouth open. Fingers press against your teeth. They scrape along your gums. They push to the back of your throat. You retch. He doesn't stop. He checks your tongue for disease. He examines your eyes. He pulls down your lip the way a buyer checks a horse at auction, because that is exactly what you are now. 12 days ago, you were the daughter of a village chief in the Sahel. 12 days ago, you had a mother who called you by your name every morning. She is dead. Did you see how it happened? And you kept walking because the men with swords made it clear. Stop moving and you'll join her. In Arabic, there is a word for what you have become. Jariya means slave, but that translation is too clean, too gentle. It hides what the word really means. What it really means is that your body is now merchandise. Your future is whatever a buyer decides to do with it. Your past no longer exists. The man inspecting you steps back and nods to another who holds a leather pouch. Coins change hands. They have just sold you for the 3rd time this month, and the place they are taking you is somewhere historians would spend centuries trying to pretend never existed. This is the Arab slave trade. 14 million Africans, 13 centuries. A system so efficient at erasing human beings that almost no descendants survive to tell the story. If this matters to you, like and subscribe. Dark Chronicler. It does not flinch from the histories the world tried to bury. You know the Atlantic slave trade, ships, chains, plantations in the Americas, 12 million Africans transported across an ocean over 400 years. That story has museums, monuments, films. Children learn it in school. Politicians give speeches about it. But there was another slave trade, older, longer, and by some measures, even larger. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century, shortly after the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests that spread across North Africa. It did not end until the 20th century. Saudi Arabia officially abolished slavery in 1962. Mauritania in 1981. Those are not ancient history dates. Those are dates your grandparents remember. There are living people today who were born in societies where this trade still operated legally. Between 650 and 1900 CE, between 14 and 17 million Africans were taken from their homes and transported to the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians argue the real number is even higher because records were inconsistent and countless deaths were never documented. More people over a longer span, across routes stretching over 3 continents. And yet almost nobody talks about it. Why? Because this trade was designed to leave no trace. And it succeeded. In the Americas today, there are about 45 million people of African descent, living proof of what happened. Their existence keeps memory alive. Their struggles for equality ensure the story cannot be fully forgotten. In the Middle East, after 1,300 years of importing millions of Africans, almost nothing. Small communities in Yemen, scattered populations in southern Iraq, a few thousand Afro-Moroccans, tiny remnants where there should be millions. Where did 14 million people go? The answer is the darkest part of this story. The men were castrated. This is not theory. It is documented in hundreds of primary sources across centuries. Arab slave traders systematically castrated African males at rates estimated between 80 and 90%. The procedure was carried out at specific points along the trade routes. Egyptian monastic sites became notorious for it. Coptic Christian monks developed techniques that slightly improved survival rates. Slightly, because for every man who survived castration, between 3 and 5 died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Some sources suggest even higher mortality. Think about that arithmetic. If a trader needed 100 living eunuchs to sell at market, he might begin with 400 or 500 men. The rest died screaming in the sand. The logic was brutal, but consistent. Castrated slaves could not reproduce. They could not form families. They could not build communities that might someday grow strong enough to resist. They could not leave descendants who might one day demand freedom. They worked, aged, died, and were replaced by new captives from the next raid, generation after generation, across 13 centuries. But the women served a completely different purpose. They were kept intact, fertile, preserved specifically for what their bodies could produce. And what happened to them is a story the historical record tells only in careful euphemisms, in silences, in details pushed between words, because writers of the time considered it too indecent to describe directly. The machine required constant fuel. Arab merchants were not usually raiders themselves. They were businessmen operating sophisticated commercial networks spanning continents. They did not personally storm villages. Instead, they built economic systems that incentivized Africans to capture and sell one another. Weapons flowed into the continent. European firearms traded through Arab intermediaries, textiles, luxury goods, salt that was precious in sub-Saharan regions, and in exchange, human beings. The kingdom of Dahomey in what is now Benin became one of the major suppliers. The kingdom's economy grew dependent on annual slave raids against neighboring peoples. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled East African routes. The Fungi Sultanate in Sudan dominated the Nile corridor. Various Tuareg groups controlled trans-Saharan passages. African kingdoms fought wars not for territory, but for human merchandise. Survivors were marched to collection points and sold to Arab traders. The cycle fed itself endlessly. More weapons meant more successful raids. More raids meant more captives. More captives meant more purchasing power. More purchasing power meant more weapons. A machine that fed on human misery and grew stronger with every life it consumed. Villages were attacked at dawn when resistance was weakest. Warriors surrounded settlements while people slept. The assault was sudden and overwhelming. Men who resisted were killed immediately. Men who surrendered were evaluated on the spot: age, health, strength. Young, strong men were separated for castration and sale. Older men without market value were often killed where they stood. But women faced different calculations. Merchants examined them with specific criteria in mind. Age mattered enormously. Girls too young would require years of feeding before they became useful. Women too old had diminished value. The ideal range was roughly 13 to 25, old enough to survive the brutal journey ahead, young enough for decades of use. Physical appearance affected price dramatically. Different markets had different preferences, and experienced traders knew them intimately. Certain body types, certain features. Ethiopian women commanded premium prices in almost every market. Their features were considered especially desirable. They could sell for double or triple what women from other regions brought. Women who fit the preferred criteria were separated immediately. They received marginally better treatment during transport, not out of compassion, never out of compassion. Damaged goods sold for less. Protecting the investment made economic sense. Families were split apart at capture sites or collection points. Mothers torn from children, husbands from wives, sisters from brothers. Lifelong bonds severed in moments with no hope of reunion. European explorers and missionaries who witnessed these separations left accounts describing scenes of unimaginable pain, the screaming, the desperate clinging as families tried to hold each other for a few seconds longer. The last contact before chains tightened and people who had loved each other their whole lives were dragged in opposite directions, never to meet again, never to know what became of the other. One missionary wrote that those sounds haunted his dreams for years, that decades later he could still hear mothers screaming their children's names, that no matter how far he traveled or how much time passed, the cries followed him. Those cries echoed across Africa for 13 centuries, and almost nobody in the outside world heard them. Then came the Sahara. The trans-Saharan routes were journeys measured not in miles, but in death. Imagine the distance from New York to Denver. Now imagine walking it in chains with almost no water, under a sun that kills. From collection points in sub-Saharan Africa to the great northern markets, Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, Marrakesh, caravans traveled distances exceeding 700 miles. Some routes stretched more than 2,000 miles. The journey took 2 to 3 months in optimal conditions. Conditions were never optimal. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. Daytime temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sand heats so fiercely it blisters skin on contact. There is no shade for hundreds of miles. Then night falls and the temperature collapses. The same desert that crushes you by day can drop below freezing after dark. The temperature swing alone killed countless people. Water was the most precious resource and rationed with brutal calculation. Camels needed water to survive. Camels were expensive. Camels were essential for carrying goods. Slaves were cheaper than camels. Slaves were replaceable. So captives received whatever water remained after the animals drank. Cracked lips bleeding, swollen tongues, the maddening certainty that there is nothing to drink and there are hundreds of miles of burning sand still ahead. Food was minimal. Dried dates, sometimes meat, enough calories to keep legs moving, never enough to preserve health after months of walking. Mortality rates were catastrophic. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30% of enslaved people died during Sahara crossings. Some caravans lost half their human cargo. Some accounts describe caravans arriving with more than 60% losses. Those who collapsed were abandoned where they fell. Stopping to bury bodies would slow the caravan. Stopping to help the dying might mean losing the living. The economy did not support compassion. People were left alive but too weak to walk, sitting in the sand as the caravan moved on, waiting to die. So the routes became marked by bones. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer who crossed the Sahara in the 1850s, documented what he saw. The road was literally strewn with human skeletons. In some valleys, the bones were so numerous one could hardly avoid stepping on them. Skulls bleached by the sun, rib cages half buried in drifting sand. These were not ancient remains. They were recent additions to trails that had been accumulating bodies for more than 1,000 years. René Caillier recorded similar horrors on western routes. He described valleys that looked white from a distance, not from sand, but from accumulated bones. Gustave Nachtigall wrote of passing through regions where skulls and bones gave the sand an almost paved quality underfoot. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions, over 13 centuries, their remains scattered across the greatest desert on earth, marking the paths that swallowed them. Silent testimony to a trade the world chose to ignore. For the women who survived, who somehow endured the heat, the cold, the thirst, and starvation, arrival at a North African port meant only that immediate death had stopped. Survival came with a price. Many arrived broken in ways that did not show on the surface. Their bodies made the journey. Their spirits did not. Their ordeal was not finished. It was changing shape. The slave markets of the Arab world were ancient institutions, refined over centuries into operations of terrifying efficiency. The Cairo market had operated continuously for over 1,000 years by the time European observers began documenting it. Generation after generation of traders had refined practices, pricing, and evaluation techniques. Buyers came from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman officials from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy Arabs from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from Gulf states, seeking domestic servants, laborers, and women for private use. Even European buyers, despite official prohibitions, found ways to participate. Markets were organized by category. Common laborers in one section, skilled workers in another, domestic servants in a third. And behind screens in the most exclusive areas, women destined for private sale. The examination process was systematic. First, the teeth. Dental health indicated age and condition. Experienced buyers could estimate years of use left from teeth alone. Then skin for disease, scars, imperfections, hair texture and length, then the rest. Buyers paying premium prices demanded thorough evaluation. The inspections were intimate, invasive, performed with the detached calculation a butcher might show when evaluating livestock. European travelers left accounts so graphic that editors often censored them. A British observer in the 1830s wrote that women were made to walk, turn, display themselves in ways he could not describe in polite company, and that buyers examined them like a rider examines a mare, with identical cold calculation and a total absence of human feeling. Prices varied by origin, appearance, and intended use. Ordinary women sold for modest sums. Women with preferred features cost far more. Young virgins from favored origins could sell for the equivalent of multiple years' wages. The highest prices were paid privately by agents representing the wealthiest households. Zanzibar became the largest slave market in the Indian Ocean world. At its peak, 50,000 enslaved people passed through annually. The entire island economy revolved around human merchandise. David Livingstone witnessed the trade firsthand. His accounts helped drive British abolition efforts. What he saw changed him permanently. He wrote that exaggerating its evils was impossible, that the subject did not admit exaggeration, that the visions he had seen were so repugnant he always tried to erase them from memory. The market operated openly until 1873, when British pressure finally forced its closure. The Sultan signed a treaty. Official auctions ended, but the trade continued underground for decades. Ships arrived at night. Transactions happened in hidden places. Demand remained too strong, profits too great. Where demand exists, supply finds a way. Where did these women go after being sold? It depended entirely on who bought them and for what. The richest buyers built harems. Ottoman sultans maintained harems with hundreds of women, sometimes thousands. The imperial harem in the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople housed up to 2,000 women at various points. Lesser nobles and provincial governors maintained smaller collections proportional to their wealth. Even moderately wealthy merchants could own several women for domestic and personal purposes. The harem was more complex than the modern word suggests. It was not merely physical gratification, it was a political institution where women competed for favor. Bearing a son to a powerful man could mean everything. The mother of a future sultan wielded immense power, so women conspired, formed alliances, undermined rivals. Poisoning was common. Political maneuvering, as sophisticated as anything in the formal court, took place behind harem walls. For an African woman taken into a harem, it meant systematic erasure of everything she had been. She was given a new name. Her language was forbidden. Her religion was replaced. Her past was destroyed and rebuilt. Instructors taught new customs, behaviors, expectations, how to walk, how to serve, what was permitted, and what was punished. Eventually, nothing remained of who she had been. The person her family loved was gone, replaced by someone shaped to serve owners. A few women navigated this system successfully. A tiny number gained real power. Kösem Sultan dominated Ottoman politics for decades. She began as an enslaved girl. Hürrem Sultan became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, an achievement almost unheard of for a former slave. But these were extraordinary exceptions recorded precisely because they were so rare. For everyone like them, thousands lived and died anonymous, used until no longer useful, and then discarded. Women sold to less wealthy buyers faced different circumstances. Many became domestic servants with additional obligations. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, and submitted when their owner desired. There was no concept of consent, no right to refuse. Islamic law technically offered certain protections to enslaved women who became mothers. A slave who bore a child to her master was called an walad, mother of a child. She could not be sold afterward. Her child was legally free at birth. Upon her owner's death, she gained her freedom. But protections required enforcement. Reality was inconsistent, and these rules only applied after pregnancy. Before that, she was property. Children born from these unions were legally free and often acknowledged. Some rose to prominence. Multiple sultans were sons of enslaved mothers. But the mothers remained enslaved unless explicitly freed. Any intimacy was forced, not chosen. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations. Features blended, African heritage diluted with each generation until it became invisible, until it vanished entirely. That was the final erasure, not only of individuals, but of their descendants, not only of life, but of evidence that those lives ever existed. If you're still here, subscribe. This story is not finished. The Arab slave trade did not end with a dramatic abolition. There was no Emancipation Proclamation, no civil war fought over it, no moment when the world rose as one and declared it over. Instead, it faded slowly and reluctantly under external pressure more than internal moral awakening. British naval power gradually closed East African routes in the late 19th century. The Royal Navy hunted slave ships. Colonial administration suppressed trans-Saharan trade as European powers carved up Africa. International pressure forced formal abolitions through the 20th century, but the legacy is not monuments, it is absence. In the modern Middle East, there are practically no descendants of the 14 million taken there. The men were castrated. The children of women were absorbed into Arab populations and their heritage diluted until it disappeared. The victims vanished so completely that most people do not even know they existed. There are no films about them. No holiday commemorates their suffering. No politician gives speeches in their memory. In 2020, archaeologists in Libya discovered a mass grave containing hundreds of remains. Analysis suggested sub-Saharan Africans who died between the 16th and 19th centuries. Almost certainly enslaved people who never completed the crossing, who collapsed and were abandoned as the caravan moved on. No names in any record, no descendants to claim them, no headstones, no memorials, nobody left to mourn them, only bones in the desert. Silent evidence of a tragedy the world decided to forget. The Atlantic trade left 45 million descendants who ensure the history cannot be forgotten. The Arab trade left silence, nothing but silence. 14 million people erased so completely we do not have their names. The woman in the market whose teeth were checked, whose body was evaluated, whose humanity was stripped inspection after inspection, we will never know what she was called before they took her name. The name her mother gave her, the name her village knew. She might have ended in a harem in Cairo, competing with dozens of women for scraps of attention from the man who owned her. She might have ended in a house in Baghdad, cooking, cleaning, submitting when called. She might have ended in a palace in Istanbul, forgotten in a corner as her youth withered. She might have had children who never learned her original language, who never heard her songs, who never knew her stories or where she came from. She might have died in the desert, her bones joining millions of others marking routes civilization tried to forget. What we know is that she existed. She suffered. She endured things no human being should ever endure. And for 13 centuries, millions like her fed a machine designed to consume them completely. The Atlantic slave trade has monuments, museums, memorials, days of remembrance. This story has sand covering bones no one will ever identify. Remember her not as a number, not as a statistic. Remember her as someone's daughter, someone who once laughed, someone who once had a name before it was erased. That is the only memorial those 14 million will ever receive. This is Dark Chronicler. We don't sanitize history. We show you what really happened. If this mattered to you, like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments what other buried history we should uncover next.